Well, good evening. We're continuing in our study we just began of Daniel, and some of tonight is going to be some review of the introductory information. Not because I don't think you weren't listening last week, but because that's kind of what I need when I start a book, is to go over it a few times and really get the framework in mind and the details that help understand the perspectives and the purpose of the book. And then as we progress through the book, we can have that in mind as we see the events that are taking place. Just to get started on, I don't remember if I even mentioned this last week, but Daniel is the author and the main character of the book. And his name means either God is judge or God is my judge. It's not clear which way because of the way of the Hebrew language, but either one of those can be looked at and understood, especially considering his character and the way that he lived his life, and then the message that he had for those around him as well. And then as we were looking at the timeline of the book last week, this was, Daniel is written after the conquer of Judah, Judah by Babylon. And just looking at the map here, we see Babylon's over here on the eastern side, and they had started at the beginning, a little bit before this book was written. There was war between Babylon and Assyria, who was in the north, and then Egypt was also part of this triangle of war. And so you can see with Judah being there somewhat in the middle of it, they would get hit from both sides or all three sides occasionally, depending on who was trying to wage war against who. So the Babylonians had begun their war against the Assyrians, and the Assyrians, who had the Assyrians conquered in the not too distant past, within the last 150 years? Israel, the northern kingdom. And so they had conquered them and wiped them out, basically, destroyed them as a nation, just as God had warned them over and over. But Israel failed to heed that warning, and so Assyria came and destroyed them. At the time, both in the prophecies of what would happen and at the time, I'm sure, people wondered, how could such a God's nation be conquered by such a godless people, a terrible people? The Assyrians have the reputation of being one of the most barbaric of those nations, especially of those three. But how could God's people be conquered by such a terrible people? And this is something that we're going to see throughout this book, is that God may have used Assyria to conquer Israel. He may have allowed that to happen, but it didn't mean that God condoned what Assyria did or what they stood for. And so we'll have a similar situation with Judah here in a moment. But Babylon had waged war against Assyria, and Egypt had decided they needed to get in on the action. Perhaps they didn't want to be the only target left, and so they thought it'd be safer if there was three of them. But Babylon defeated Assyria, and in the battle with Egypt, they were victorious against Egypt in that battle, which basically drove Egypt back to its home, and they didn't come up that way again. They just were satisfied with staying in Egypt and in the surrounding areas, and didn't pose a threat to Babylon after that. So as that event was happening, just as Nebuchadnezzar was leading that battle and was victorious against Assyria and Egypt, and right around that time, Nebuchadnezzar's father died. And so Nebuchadnezzar didn't take the long route home up all the way to the north and then around south. He took the straight line. He try to get home as quickly as possible. And so he had to cross the desert to do that, from what I read, and which was a dangerous and problematic journey in itself. But he certainly felt that it was important to get home as soon as possible so that he could claim the throne that was his as opposed to someone else claiming it. So this is where we find ourselves when we begin this book. And Daniel was mentioned, but as prophets go, he's a contemporary with two other prophets at this time. Does anybody know what other prophets were active at this point? Ezekiel was one of them, and Jeremiah was the other. And so there are these three prophets that really were the primary prophets at this time. There may have been some overlap with some others, but I think most of the other prophets had come prior to this or after. And so there are many prophets that were saying, repent, repent. If you don't repent, terrible things are going to happen. And so now we're in this point where terrible things were happening. And so there is not necessarily, at least for Daniel's prophecy, there wasn't that call to repentance, but rather for endurance. And so Jeremiah was the prophet that was back in Judah. And so he was prophesying to those in Jerusalem and Judah and telling them to do what they were supposed to do, to accept this punishment and not make more problems for themselves than they already had. And Ezekiel, he was actually taken in the second group of captives, and he was also over in Babylon, not necessarily in the city, but he was in Babylonia with the other captives. And so he was more out in the country with more of the slave population of Judah. And then Daniel was taken the first wave of captivity, as we'll see later today. And he was really in the king's court for most of his time. His position was elevated rather quickly. And then as time went on, things happened. People forget about what great things he had done. And so then he would do something else and be raised up again. And so he was pretty high up, sometimes perhaps second in command of the nation. So those are the three prophets that are active during this period of time, and their locations and who they were prophesying to. But we see Daniel in particular, like I said, was taken in the first captivity, or the first deportation, I should say, and then lived in Babylon among royalty. So we talked a little bit about this last week, but what was really the purpose of the captivity, of the deportation that was done? There's three waves of deportations of people and probably things taken from Jerusalem and Judah. And what was the one of the purposes? There are many purposes of that, but does anybody remember any purpose? So first, Nebuchadnezzar saw this as an effective way of removing the existing leadership, or at least the structure around the leader that he wanted to have there as a puppet leader. And so he left the king that was originally there. He said, you can stay. But then he took all his, basically took all his resources, all his wise young men that would grow into being that support system for that king. And so it really cut the legs out from under that leadership. Any other ideas, Steve?
You get the best wisdom from all the nations.
Right. So he didn't just go in there and kill those leaders. No, he wanted to take advantage of that. And so he took the wise people, the wise young men from those nations, and built them into his own cabinet, so to speak. And so he would get the benefit of the wisdom that they would bring as well. Steve?
Disrupt culture. So if you deported one person, some people from this area to this area, and other people from kind of back and forth, then people would settle in and start living again instead of trying to fight to defend their homeland.
Right. So if you disrupt the social system, then there's less likelihood that people are going to be attacking you in rebellion than there would be that they're trying to rebuild and reestablish their system. However, the Jews did manage to get comfortable enough with what they had rebuilt to then also rebel, which led to the second and third deportations, and eventually to the destruction of the temple and the walls and the nation as it stood there in Jerusalem. Before we move on, any other ideas on the purposes of those deportations? All right, and I think the other main purpose of the deportation really was not from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, but from God's point of view. I think God was using those deportations as a way to protect the country, protect his nation, so that it would be preserved. He knew they're not going to listen, and they're going to end up getting themselves destroyed there in Jerusalem. And he took those people, those wise individuals, and put them over in Babylon where he could protect them and keep them safe as a remnant, so that when it was time for that punishment to be complete, when the time was up there, he could have them be restored to Jerusalem and rebuild the nation, rebuild the temple, and so forth. So it seems like a terrible thing for your people to be taken into captivity and be taken away from you. But really, it was a very loving thing of God to do, for God to allow that to happen so that they would be preserved as a nation. And I think that was foreshadowed. We saw with Moses the Israelites going into Egypt to be saved from the famine that was occurring. If they hadn't gone into that relationship with Egypt that turned into slavery and captivity, if they hadn't gone into Egypt, they would have likely perished like many of the other nations around them, especially considering they were a nation of 70 plus people. And so it would be very dangerous for their livelihood if they had tried to remain outside of that captivity that God was using to protect them. Whereas when they were included in that, Pharaoh was, especially at the beginning, Pharaoh was very generous with them and took care of them far more than they could have taken care of themselves. And we see that's God's grace and mercy. And we can parallel that to how God takes care of us far more than we would ever expect and could ever do for ourselves. So as we looked at the book itself with the contents, there were two main themes that I highlighted, and those were, first, God rules the kingdoms of men. And this is, throughout the book, there's times where this is repeated, and Daniel 2, 4, and 5 both have stories and prophecies and interpretations from God that really are driving this point home, first of all, to Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar, whoever was getting the message at that time. But also, this wasn't a book that was just written to the Babylonians or the Medes and Persians. This was a book that was written for the benefit of the Jews. We often think about how, who was the audience of this book? And a lot of people will say, well, the Jews were one audience and we are another. I think, put it like that is kind of out of whack. I think the purpose for us is far less than what the purpose was for the Jews, because this book was given to them as they were coming out of captivity. And the stories that are provided in this book, and going along with that second theme, be faithful in suffering, I think were intentionally given to those people at that time so that they would be able to know how to live during that period of time, so that they would be prepared. I think the audience of that, the primary, by far and away, the primary audience of this book is the Jewish people from the return from captivity to the destruction of the Jewish system in 70 AD. I mean, it's a long time period for an audience, but it was the things we're going to see in this book are specifically given to those people so that they would be properly equipped to be able to handle the lives that they were going to be living and enduring, and that also they would be prepared for when events occurred, so that they would understand that God is in control. We don't need to worry about these ups and downs of these nations. We just need to remain faithful to God and know that in His time, He will accomplish what He is looking to accomplish. And so, while we are definitely benefited by this book, I think listing us as an audience would be a little bit of an overstep. But yeah, the audience, these people needed this book at this time in order to accomplish what they needed to do in their lifetimes. Any thoughts on that?
Extraordinary how people today will take what's in Daniel and try to make an application to the times that we're living in. And it's just, in doing that, it's just completely out of context. I mean, that's not the purpose for the book.
Exactly. And you know, I don't want to overstate my case that we're not the audience, but that's exactly my point, is that this book wasn't written for us to warn us about things that might happen. This was written for us and delivered to us so that we could see Daniel telling about things that would happen and then them happen. And that's the benefit to us and that builds our faith, is that Daniel predicted these rise and fall of these nations, and it occurred just like he described it. And the validity of the book and the aging of the book is absolutely beyond or before when these events happen. That's one thing that people try to say, well, this couldn't have been written back then, because how could he have known what was going to happen? Well, that's the whole point of the book. This isn't a book of history. It's a book of prophecy. And so Daniel and the Jews in the Jewish writings, they completely identify Daniel as being written during these times, even if they don't agree with us of what it means in the interpretation. Mike, do you have a comment?
No, the only thing, in addition to that, the only applications that I see that are being made like this is the lessons that were taught and learned by those people. Because let's face it, nothing new is ever happening.
Right.
And so we're repeating history of some sort from some time period or whatever. And all too often, what plays out in the Bible replays itself in different peoples.
Right.
And so we can learn from those applications.
Yes.
And that's the big thing that we can get out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, the example that Daniel provides to us is one of faithfulness, that we can see, here's how he responded in these situations, here's how the other young men responded. What can we learn from that? How can we apply that and respond in similar ways? John?
And yet, towards the end, which I'm not going to say much about, is...
Don't give it away.
Huh?
So don't give it away.
Don't give it away. Is that it does prophesy about the Messiah, Christ coming to earth and setting up His kingdom. So that does apply to us, I believe.
Right. Well, and we saw, I mean, it applies to us in the sense that now we're beneficiaries of that.
Yeah.
That, you know, we saw that happen and that fulfilled. And anytime you see a prophecy and the fulfillment, that's the purpose of the prophecy, is for when it's fulfilled, you can know that it came from God. And it can build your faith and strengthen. Any other comments on the themes? God rules in the kingdoms of men, or be faithful in suffering? All right. So just a little quiz here, and if you haven't read through Daniel, it's going to be a little difficult, but does anybody have a suggestion on a theme or a chapter key for what happened in chapter 1 that we'll be talking about tonight?
Look it up, is this an open book?
This is an open book. Yeah, Introduction to Daniel is a good, yeah, and his buddies. So it's an introductory chapter that Daniel gives us, trying to set the stage for what the other things that he's going to tell us about what happened in the visions. And within that introduction, we see that the setup is that Daniel was taken captive to Babylon and tested. And not just Daniel, but as we read, other young men were taken to Babylon. And we see more detail about it, but that's kind of the general idea. Chapter 2. Matt?
This is the dream.
Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar's dream, one of his dreams, and the interpretation. And I couldn't think of a concise way to describe the dream. The multi-metal man or something like that. So that's that dream. And then the interpretation as well. And then chapter 3. Jamie? Okay. So
that was the start of it, was they were supposed to worship that idol.
right. So I went with fiery furnace, but the cause of it was the worshiping the golden idol, or refusal to worship the golden idol. And that one involved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who we'll talk about this evening. But really the memorable part to me is the fiery furnace. And that's what the songs and so forth. Oh, I gave that one away. Chapter 4. And wow, Rick, you're good. So Nebuchadnezzar, humbled and restored, as Rick so astutely put it. So this one is, a really, you might not remember all the details with just this description, but it talks about Nebuchadnezzar's dream, his second dream that we were given, and what events occurred because of that dream that was foreshadowing, and then how he responded to it. And he responded in a positive way, and he was restored. I did it again. I'm not going to let Rick answer this one. Chapter 5 is Belshazzar humbled, and there's a miraculous event that happens, and Belshazzar then is humbled, and he doesn't respond and doesn't have the same result as Nebuchadnezzar, so we don't have restored on that one. Chapter 6, Lion's Den. This is like the highlight of most people remember about the book of Daniel, and rightly so. It's a very powerful episode. And Daniel's visions of the four beasts is, that's 7. I clicked right this time, and then I tricked myself. So chapter 7 is Daniel's vision of the four beasts, and that correlates to that chapter 2, where we see the dream of the multi-material man, and it's just a different a way of describing a different things are highlighted in that description and interpretation. All right, chapter 8. What's that?
Vision of the ram and goat.
Yes, Daniel's vision of the ram and goat, which go along with the previous visions, are kind of highlighting more specifics. And then 9, Daniel's prayer. And I put Daniel's prayer in the 70 weeks. They're kind of both highlighted in that. And then I put 10 and 11 together. anybody has.
Daniel's fasting and he gets a bit, kind of the interpretation of the dream, is that?
Yeah. It's, the way I put it was an angel tells of the kings of the north and south, which kind of gives that, or a fuller interpretation of that. And then chapter 12. I put the time of the end as opposed to the end of times. And I think the wording is, slight difference, but I think it's important wording difference because of the way that people interpret what that chapter means. And we'll talk more about that. So as I mentioned last week, I kind of see a structure in Daniel where chapters 1, his introduction and talking about being taken captive. Chapter 3 with the fiery furnace, and chapter 6, the lion's den, those each have stories of faithful suffering. And so we can kind of group those together. And then chapters 2 and 7, multi-metal man and the four beasts, talk about the four empires rise and fall. And then 4 with Nebuchadnezzar's humbling and restoration, and 5, Belshazzar's humbling, talks about kind of going under the heading of God humbles the proud. And then 8 through 12 then go into detail with visions leading to the time of the end. So I would group those together. It's interesting how Daniel doesn't go in how we would usually group things together. He has kind of a string method where things end up matching up and kind of a mirror structure of those first several chapters. So any comments or questions on those overarching ideas of the book? All right, well, let's get into the text then. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So we're going to stop there. We see this in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim. And that's only, that might be important to you later if you're trying to look at how the dates match up, if somebody questions the way that they dated things. But Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. So when Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, when we were talking about that map and his wars, he was not king at that time, right? Because it was after he conquered Jerusalem the first time that his father died and he came back. But I think this you wouldn't write about Nebuchadnezzar after he became king without calling him King Nebuchadnezzar. Just like we talk about our presidents, you don't just you refer to them as president after their terms are over still. And so we see Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And so I put on here first that Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem, but really the second point is that God delivered it into his hand. And this is right off the bat Daniel establishing that God is in control, that God rules in the kingdoms of men. And so he's saying that it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar that just had the idea and had the ability, and so he did it and was responsible, and nothing could stop him. But rather, God allowed that to happen at that time. Israel's time was full, or Judah's time was full, and so it was time for them to be conquered. And so he took into his hand were given some of the vessels of the house of God. I think this is an interesting little fact that just like God preserved the people by sending them into this captivity, he protected the vessels in the temple by letting them be taken into captivity. A lot of nations, a lot of other nations, they might have taken these artifacts of gold, almost, when you read through the instructions on how these things were made and the descriptions, there's just untold numbers of gold, silver, bronze, and other metals, and in some places it says that the collections were too numerous to count. The nations that might have conquered them could have just taken all that stuff and melted it down because they didn't believe in the God that those items were made for. So they might melt those down and form them into items that would help in the worship of their gods in their land. But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do that. And I think part of it is just a wise strategy of trying to incorporate the gods of the nations that he conquers so that there will be less pushback, less blowback from destroying those things. And he tried to avoid destroying the temple as much as he could, but eventually he had no choice. Same with these items. He could have just destroyed them, but he knew it would be wiser to take them and bring them back. And when you take, say, the Ark of the Covenant, when you take that and you put that in your shrine to your God, as Nebuchadnezzar did, and you put it at the foot of the shrine to your God, that really is sending a message that my gods conquered your gods. They had that message to him. So it wasn't just purely altruistic. There was a purpose to him taking those things, but he didn't destroy them. He had a better, more wisdom than to do that. And so he took those, and it had been prophesied in Jeremiah, I believe, Jeremiah or Isaiah, that the items would be taken from the temple, that they would be carried off and taken away. But the good news was that they were preserved, just like the people. They were preserved and were able to be restored to Judah when the time was right. And they were able to be taken back, and the items that were available were taken back and back to the temple so that they could worship God. Mike?
Nebuchadnezzar had enough, shall we say, wherewithal not to mess with them.
Yeah.
He took them, he locked them up in the treasury, he left them alone.
Yeah.
Not so much for his son.
Right. Yeah, and we'll see more about how some people weren't as wise in their dealings with those items. Any other comments, Jamie?
Do you know maybe the reason why in Daniel they say it's the 3rd year, and in Jeremiah he says it's the 4th year?
Third.
There's a time.
Yes.
There.
So Daniel is Babylonian expatriate, I guess, or Jewish expatriate? I don't know. Whatever one is, that he's practically been assimilated entirely into Babylon, except he's remained, faithful and pure. But he speaks and later he'll be writing in Aramaic and expressing himself in very Babylonian ways. And I think the real difference is just the way that the Jews measured their time versus the way the Babylonians did. How many days was Jesus in the grave? 3 days. But if, in our American mind, with our watches, and 72, he wasn't in there 72 hours. Right. So that's not 3 days. Well, that's kind of showing a difference between how we calculate time and how they calculate time. They would count just any part of the first year when Jehoiakim became king. So he could have came in October, and they would, the next year in June, they would say in the 2nd year of his reign. And so in the 3rd year, the way the Babylonians counted, that your first year wouldn't count. It was the first calendar year of your reign. And so it was the 3rd year of his calendar reign, but the 4th in the Jewish counting of time. So that's how those match. Julie?
In Ezra, when they bring all of the vessels back from the temple, they say these are the things that Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple, and just the gold and silver pieces was 5,400 pieces of service, table service and stuff like that.
Yeah, so it was a huge treasure trove of things that Nebuchadnezzar could have probably used. He could have financed some more hanging gardens, expanded, get another level up there somehow. But he was wiser than that. Steve?
So, like, if you read about David and the gold he collected, and he didn't conquer a very big area.
Right.
But it was measured in like thousands or hundreds of thousands of tons of gold.
Yeah.
Like just from, and so if Nebuchadnezzar's conquering the world, he's going to be wealthy.
Right.
And so, I mean, just they're capturing the treasury of all these nations they take over. That's one of the benefits of it. So really, he didn't really need to melt it down.
Right.
The artistry probably had more value to him than the actual material.
Yeah.
And so preserving that culture to him, there's a benefit in it, because his goal was to put them back on their land, loyal to him.
Right.
But first you have to make them part of Babylon, and then you send them back, and then they can worship their God as part of Babylon instead of, and the Babylonians were very Unitarian, so they didn't like just dishonor everyone's God.
Right.
They said, hey, it's the God of that area, my God's better,
Right.
but, serve your God. But and so there was kind of an understanding there. They're kind of Unitarian in that sense.
Yes, they were very open to the gods of the nations they were conquering, just as long as you knew that their God was better than your God.
And when Cyrus was doing that was part of the Babylonian way of conquering, and that kept the people loyal. That really did a lot to consolidate the reign.
Yeah, and this is when, at the very beginning, when Nebuchadnezzar tried to go through and just conquer them and use that as leverage to keep them, to have them pay tribute to him and to have them be loyal to him. It wasn't just that he stole those things. Perhaps it was a sense of, I'm going to honor you by taking these to my nation. There's a lot of ways that we don't really get all the details on the interpersonal value of the way that they did things. But I think Nebuchadnezzar was a really clever, wise guy in a lot of ways. Some shortcomings, of course. But I think he was acting in a way that really was effective, had been effective in the past, and was effective with most countries and nations that they conquered as he was going. So, again, we see that God delivered them into his hand, and he took those items and put them in the treasury of his God. And then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So this is where we see him taking the human part of this treasure. And so he got people, young youths that were without blemish, good in appearance, skillful in all wisdom, knowledge, understanding, learning. And these are just, adjectives that are very complimentary. These people are ones who had set themselves apart, and they're youths. So your guess is as good as mine as what the actual age of Daniel was when he was taken. But for a lot of people, and for ease of just thinking about it as far as numbers, a lot of people will just round it to 20. Could be give or take 5 years. I doubt it would be any younger than 15 or 16. For them to be really wise and thoughtful at that point would be amazing. But no. But No offense to any 15 or 16-year-olds if we have any right now. But some of those traits begin to, really come out around 17, 18, 19, 20. And so having that time, and you just have to imagine that Daniel probably had a pretty good home life for him to turn out this way, for him to be as faithful as he was. He probably had really good and faithful parents that had put that into him throughout the years, so that when he was in this position of being considered for being taken, that people were saying, yeah, Daniel's... Now, I don't know if the Jews nominated their own people to be taken, how that worked. It doesn't seem like Nebuchadnezzar would have spent that much time getting to know them at that point. But this was a little bit after the conquering, so he sent his chief down there to get them. So we don't know exactly how long after the initial conquer it was, within that first year, I believe. And so he and his friends left a very good impression on the chief of the eunuchs. Steve, do you have? Wow.
and stuff. So, there's a period of time where guys who just pushed a little harder, maybe because of shorter life expectancy or whatever. So.
Yeah, and whether it's shorter life expectancy or no electricity, so there's no phones and no internet, nothing else to do for a lot of people, then maybe they were able to focus a little bit more of their energy and attention on building up their intellect and their character. But for whatever reason, these men stood out, and they say they were of royal family and of nobility. And so we don't know for sure which of these applies to Daniel. He could have been a descendant of David. We don't, but he could have just been of a noble family. But the people that were there in Jerusalem, they're really just Judah and Benjamin, and so we would guess that he would probably have come from Judah at that time. But we don't know for sure which group or which term applied to him. And then in verse 4, they were brought to, took people that were competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So the Chaldeans, what famous Bible person came from the Chaldees? Abraham. Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, and so this is a people that have been around and may actually have some shared blood back to Abraham with Daniel, but they had established themselves as a knowledgeable people, a wise people, and also involved in sorcery and magic and so forth. So they were going to learn teach them what they could from them. And then in verse 5, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Oh yeah, I forgot, it says that they're from Judah, so we don't have to guess about that. So it identifies this wasn't just that they were taken as prisoners and put in a jail cell and with a chalkboard and they had school all day. They were taken in and given room and board and of the good stuff. I mean, there were other captives that were taken over there. I think the ones that Ezekiel was prophesying to that would have had a rougher life. But Daniel was in that very cared for and taken care of group of people that were over there, and were getting the food equivalent to what the king ate. So that was very high end for them and very well taken care of. And we see the names of the people, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So we're going to see that Daniel's the only one. Occasionally when he's talking with Nebuchadnezzar, his Babylonian name will be used, but throughout pretty much the rest of the time, he's referred to still as Daniel. And I think that just is an indicator that he retained his Jewishness. He retained his identity as one of God's people, and not to mention that the fact that his name means God is the judge, or God is my judge, that I think carried weight as well with him, as opposed to being named Belteshazzar, which could be a tribute or honor to an old past king or even a Babylonian god. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get their Babylonian names, and that's what we remember them as typically. But they're catchy names, so. Julie?
There are some people who think that some of these men or eunuchs had been made eunuchs. Is
Yes.
that what you understood?
That is very possible, because, the chief of the eunuchs was the one who was tasked with going and getting these people, and a lot of times the men that would be in these positions in the king's court would be eunuchs, and whether it was so as not to have any problems with the women there or whatever it was, that was just a standard thing to do. And we see even up to, I think, the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, he was the treasurer for the court of Candace or Candace. I think he wasn't just naturally a eunuch. I think he was made that way having to do with his role in the court. So, I hadn't really thought about it much before, doing this class, but that I lean toward the fact that probably is the case.
Some of them will be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon.
Right, and that prophecy was one of the reasons that I really thought, wow, I hadn't really thought about that before. That really makes sense, that would be the case. So as the chief of the eunuchs was going to get them, he's going to be in charge of them. He's going to, it just makes sense that he's going to be the chief of them in the future. So that does make sense. So, that's another aspect of faith and suffering that, he had to endure that. So, but verse 6, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. So Daniel resolved, first of all, I like the words that are used here, because it's not just that he decided or he didn't want to be defiled. He resolved to not be defiled. He made a conscious decision that had strength and weight to it. And so that, we're going to talk about what we can do with this information in this example. But he resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or wine that he drank. So imagine being taken into captivity, perhaps being made a eunuch, and then, but yet you're given the greatest food in the land, the greatest food and drink, and you reject it. That's pretty bold. That's something that a lot of people would be like, well, I don't really have a choice. But Daniel decided he did have a choice, and he was going to make his choice not to be defiled by it. And God helped him. God gave him favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. The chief of the eunuchs said, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So would you endanger my head with the king? So the chief knows his role in this. His role is not to question. His role is not to take liberties with the instructions that he's been given. It's to do what the king said, and if he doesn't, it's potential death sentence. And so, but yet, we hear that he has compassion for Daniel. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be, and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. And so he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. So Daniel identifies there's this problem, and then he comes up with a solution that he presents. Well, let's try this. And at the end he says, let's try this for 10 days and come see how it looks. If we don't pass the eye test, then we'll do, what does he say? Deal with your servants according to what you see. That's also has a great measure of faith by Daniel, saying that, okay, I'm going to put my trust in God that this is going to work. We're going to eat these foods, and everyone knows you can't survive on vegetables and water. So, no.
Where's the beef?
Yeah, I mean, it's, for many of us, this seems like additional faithfulness and suffering. But Daniel didn't want to be defiled by what they were eating. So what about that food might have defiled Daniel? John? Could have been unclean. I think, did you say pork? Yeah, it could have been unclean food. There's quite a few things that they couldn't eat, and so things that many of us find delicious, like bacon. But yet Daniel would forego that, and so he didn't want to be defiled by that. Bruce?
Daniel knew what the law of Moses said as far as how the meat should be prepared, how it should be slaughtered, and all of that. He didn't know what their practices were here. I think the primary thing was that he probably thought that this was meat and wine that had been offered to their pagan gods. And so by consuming that, basically he's saying, we're validating or we're just going along with, the worship of paganism. And he just wasn't going to do that.
So the aspect of idolatry. Matt?
I think what Bruce says is right on as well. I don't think he necessarily even knew for sure if that food was unclean. I think it was just even the thought of the possibility of it being that way. He wasn't going to take that chance.
Okay, so just being, better safe than sorry, or being extra cautious about that possibility. Larry?
Well, I also think there was good wisdom in saying, just give us vegetables and water, instead of saying, okay, now we're going to need our beef,
Kosher.
this way, we're going to,
Yeah.
because that would have just complicated and made us,
Yeah, it was
made the decision much harder for the overseers.
definitely wise to make it as simple as possible and not be a burden in their request. Mike?
One of the things, going back to the law of Moses, was dealing with blood. A lot of societies, part of their food is made from blood.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that was definitely going to be a big one for them.
Yep, that was really the other one I was looking for, was the idea of unclean food the fact that it may have been dedicated to idols, and we know from Paul's writing that isn't necessarily, those idols aren't real, so it doesn't necessarily carry the weight. But in a situation where it looks like you're condoning the practice, then that's going to be a problem. And so you don't want people to think that you agree with that. And I think Daniel's method of avoiding that, it was wise and a good thing to do. And then the possibility of blood, that was another common thing. And in countries today, there are people that will use the blood in various things, or not drain the animals the way that God described to get the life out of the animal. So those all were different ways that may have defiled him. But what can we see from that example? And we might not even have time to read the whole thing, but from that example, we can see a way to get out in front of situations that may arise in our lives. We may start a new job, and the schedule is flexible, and if we don't set out some conditions ahead of time, say, I really can't work on Sundays, or I can't work Sunday mornings during worship service, then we're allowing that to continue, or allowing the result to happen, basically. Daniel didn't wait and wait a few months or a year until that, well, I really have to say something. I can't eat this stuff anymore. No, he did it right up front, right at the beginning, so that there was that expectation. There was set the expectation that this was going to be a problem for him, but he did it in the most kind and considerate way, so that he would put the chief at ease, that he wouldn't lose his head over it either. So we need to be able to look at whether it's sports or activities in general that may cause conflicts in our schedule or work, or even certain aspects of jobs that conflict with our morals. Somebody might be having a very hard time finding a job, but then they find out, well, there's this opening as a bartender and I can make a lot of money. That's going to conflict with your principles, and you have to know ahead of time in advance that you're not going to do that. And that's really an obvious and glaring thing. But there are smaller pieces within people's jobs that sometimes can have those problems. The boss expecting you to fudge the numbers a little bit and not report everything that he doesn't want to report, or inflate this a little bit. Establishing up front that you're going to have to do what your conscience guides you, and you're not going to be able to participate in that. And if that means not being able to have that job, then being at peace with that. It's a little easier right now where it's an employee's market. People can't find people to hire, but we know that that's going to change, because it's always going up and down. And eventually there's going to be a time where jobs are hard to find, and we're going to be faced with that possibility that, well, it would be a little bit easier to find a job if I was willing to go beyond what my conscience allows. And so we just have to set that up front, that we're not going to do that and not allow ourselves to be defiled. So at the end of the 10 days, they were found to be better in appearance than the other youths, which could qualify as another miracle within this book, but I think it was just natural. So the steward took away their food and gave them the vegetables. And as for the 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king commanded they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And so God helped them in their education, in this learning process. And some of it was their natural aptitude, but I think the way that Daniel states this is he states it humbly, giving credit to God also, and they were found to be 10 times better than all the others. Steve?
The wisdom found in Scripture was distinguished from the wisdom of the kingdoms of the world. And even though now Bible's everywhere and it's used everywhere, but for them, that was like a unique thing that would set them apart anyways, just knowing the Proverbs, knowing the Scripture from God. And God said this is going to be your glory, is to have wisdom that sets you apart. And so that's another aspect of it, is where those Jewish boys would have just had a different level of wisdom just because it's revelation instead of...
Right. Yeah, and that's where, the Code of Hammurabi was, I think, like 500 years before this, somewhere around there, where he laid out these laws and codes of how to treat people and how things should be. When we look back at them, it all kind of mirrors what we find in the Bible, and it's a cheap version of what we find in the Bible. God's wisdom is so far above men's that men come up with what's the top wisest thing that has been written so far, and it pales in comparison to what God gives us.
Sheba is going to rise up against this generation because she saw the value of Solomon's wisdom and paid dearly for it, and yet something greater, Solomon, is here, and you're ignoring it. And it's just one of those things, like, if what they had was good, what we have is better.
Right. So God's wisdom has always been something that has been treasured, at least by the people that know what they're holding. But it's something that we have access to, and we can see from Daniel's example that when God's wisdom is accepted and used properly, it can do great things. I was thinking about becoming a manager in a past position that I had, and so they had me take this manager's test, and it was really kind of funny because as I was going through, I just thought, okay, what does the Bible tell me about what I should do in this situation? And it was like I had a cheat code or something. I took the test, and later the person I was interviewing with said, "How did you do that? I don't think I've seen a score that high." And I of course took credit for myself, but no, I just said, well, I just used biblical principles, and it's all just stuff that's been taught to me throughout the years. And when you use biblical principles, problems tend to dissolve. They become much smaller and easier to deal with, so that when you get down to what the real root of the problem is, it tends to be something that you can say, the Bible tells me how to handle this, and I don't have to worry and fret and wonder if I'm doing the right thing. I can tell this is what I should do. It may not be easy and it may not be fun, but the Bible will give us the answers. And like we were talking about last week, God's not a God of surprises. He's not waiting to trick us. He's giving us the answers ahead of time. And that's what he was doing with Daniel and these men, is giving them the biblical principles that they had grown up on. And then Nebuchadnezzar's schooling and things, I'm sure they gave them additional knowledge. But I think any of the true wisdom came back to God's word being the source of those things. And so they were very successful in that. So in 21, Daniel was there until the first year of the king Cyrus. And so, like Steve was saying, this is an introduction to Daniel, of who Daniel is and how he got here. It kind of covers the whole thing from when he got there to the end of the Babylonian kingdom, because Cyrus was of the Persian kingdom. And so he gives us that kind of overview. And then next week, we're going to be going to chapter 2 and going back to events that happened during the time of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Any last comments or questions? Sorry, I went way over this time. Well, we had good conversation, so hopefully it wasn't too much of a burden. All right, let's close with a word of prayer.